Hi. Okay, so I feel like I've done this before because I was prepared to go on live at 7, but for some reason it just didn't work. So I went through my presentation and kind of, so I'm kind of doing it for a second time. Okay. So I want to talk about the six stages framework, and I want to pull up some slides because I was all prepared to kind of share this with you earlier. Um, and and it's really an opportunity just to explore how the six stages framework can be applied to other areas, not just in terms of racism, which is what my book focuses on, but also in terms of other areas, and other areas of discriminations. Um, so let me see whether I can pull up some slides and share those with you. Right. Okay, I'm not sure whether you are able to see this, but let me get started. So, I mean, basically, I've just recently published a book. It's called Understanding and Dealing with Everyday Racism, the Six Stages Framework. And the book focuses on how we can support our understanding in terms of racism and also how we can work out where we are in terms of our development in this area. But, today I really want to talk about how we're adapting the six stages framework to other areas of discriminations. So, I think the first thing to say is that, the kind of the key principles, and I'm not sure whether you can see the slides, but I'm going to share them anyway. So the first thing says that I've got, two websites. One is inclusionpsychologist.com, and the other one is the six stages framework.com. So please check out my websites, and you'll be able to find quite a lot of information there in terms of some of the events I hold. Okay, so let's talk about the principles which underpin the six stages framework. And some of the principles are listed, and I'm hoping that you can see this. But the principles are building bridges of empathy, caves of privilege, the prejudice, racism, equity spectrum, perspective taking, allyship, and being prepared to be uncomfortable. Work in this area when we talk about discriminations, it's not easy, and it's important to kind of be able to show up in the space and be prepared to be uncomfortable and to really kind of introspect and look at some of your biases and discriminations. We all have biases, we all have discriminations, and it's just really about kind of trying to understand how they show up and how we can actually be better prepared to challenge them. So, the framework is really designed to support individuals to understand and challenge discrimination, which includes, racism. It focuses on supporting individuals and organizations in exploring their beliefs, their values, their behaviors, and really kind of thinking about, how these show up not only in terms of as individuals, but actually how they show up, within organizations. So racism and discrimination exists in all racial groups, and it'll show up, in different, kind of at different levels. And it's just important to know how it's showing up for you as an individual and also how it's showing up within your workplace. So the stages support individuals and organizations to identify where they are in terms of their awareness and understanding of different discriminations. And within my book, I talk about steps for coming out of caves of privilege. And that can be adapted to think about steps of coming out of, caves of discrimination. And there can be different discriminations, whether it be, that we're talking about disability, or we're talking about LGBTQ issues, or gender discrimination. And the stages are really designed to explore where you are in terms of those discriminations, and to think about the work you need to do in supporting you to move forward. So it's really important in kind of, in carrying out this work, that an individual is committed. So a commitment to the framework enables individuals and organizations to really kind of embark on a unique journey. So you're able to identify where you are on the framework, and it's developmental in nature, and kind of requires that kind of growth mindset. And recently I've been talking about this work very much in terms of kind of personal development and looking at personal transformation, because it's only by being committed to the work that we can actually, develop in this area as individuals, and also that organizations can develop in this area. So once you've identified where you are on the framework, you're then kind of supported to kind of to formulate an action plan and steps which you can take to move you to the next stage in terms of combating discrimination and racial bias. Okay, so I've said, the Six Stages framework is very much a personal development program, and it's also an organizational tool. And it really encourages us to think about where are you as an organization in terms of your journey, but also where are you as an individual in terms of your journey? What action do you need to take to progress through the stages? And I'll be sharing the stages shortly. And I've already said that whilst the Six Stages framework was originally formulated to consider issues of discrimination in terms of racial bias and racism, we're adapting them to other areas. So we're adapting them to areas around disability, around gender discrimination, and, areas around kind of, things like violence towards women, and looking at kind of how those behaviors show up. And when I run the Eventbrite seminars, which I run on a monthly basis, I usually kind of ask, the participants, how do your biases show up in these different areas? So you can actually map out how your biases are showing up in the different areas, and you can compare where you are in terms of your development. So you can look at how your biases are showing up in terms of disability, in terms of sexism. And people will often say, actually, I'm on a stage +3 for disability, but I'm on a stage, +1 in terms of racism. So you can actually compare where you are in terms of your developmental, progress and understanding in those areas. So, I've said the Six Stages framework enables people to explore their beliefs in a safe and kind of no blame environment. And it's really important. I can't kind of articulate that more, but it's just so important that we set up those safe spaces. And I've been doing some work recently, with some organizations where they've said they've tried to do this work internally, but actually things have gone wrong. And, it's left people feeling very vulnerable and not wanting to have these conversations. So essentially, you're getting people going into corners, into silos, and really not wanting to talk about these areas. So it's so important that before this work begins, we set up those safe spaces. It's important to kind of increase insight and support individuals to reflect on their biases without being defensive, and to support them to challenge prejudices and misconceptions and stereotypes. I also talk about the importance of understanding some of our basic survival instincts and how this shows up in areas where we kind of feel we feel that we're different or others are different. So I talk about kind of social constructs in these areas. And it's important to look at how we can support individuals to shift their behaviors and thinking in terms of their interactions with others. And as I've already said, to emerge from any caves of privilege or caves of entitlement or caves of discriminations. Okay, so what are the 6 stages? The 6 stages, it kind of show up on the positive and negative axis. So on the positive axis, they run from +1 right up to +6. And I'll start by talking about the positive axis, and then I'll explain what the negative axis looks like. So the positive axis, +1, is where people are showing that kind of lack of awareness, and they can appear kind of ignorant and oblivious and often silence when discussions are ahead within these areas. And they're often in denial about the existence of the difficulties in that area. So if we're talking about racism, they'll often be of the view that actually, racism doesn't really exist and that it's something which is made up. Stage 2 is where individuals are showing up as dismissive. So it's not that they're unaware, but they're aware, but they're dismissive of the issues, and they'll avoid talking about the discriminations, whether it be issues of disability or whether it be issues of racism or gender issues. So they'll be dismissive and avoidant of issues of difference and diversity. And stage 3 is where individuals are becoming more aware of issues of difference. And stage 4 is where they're more open to learning and having meaningful conversations and challenging perceptions, their own perceptions and those of others. And stage 5 is where individuals are able to reflect and genuinely engage in talking about differences and discriminations. And they're really kind of able to see the bigger picture around differences. And I often talk about, kind of a paradigm shift. So they're really kind of able to understand how the different discriminations show up, and actually to explore not only how they deal with them, but also how others do. And stage 6 is where people show up as leaders, in their field. So they're able to kind of promote equity and acceptance, and they join with others for the greater good and for the sake of humanity. So you'll find more details about the stages on my websites. So that's either on inclusionpsychologist.com or on the 6stagesframework.com website. Okay, so I've talked about the positive axis. Let's talk about the negative axis. So the negative axis is where really kind of, you get an initial mirroring of what happens on the positive axis. So stage -1 and -2 really kind of mirror stages +1 and stages +2. But then the negative axis, you start getting that spiraling, what I've been referring to as kind of a spiraling out of control, where unless interventions and support is put in place, people can spiral from stage -2 right down to -6. And so stage -2 is where people are kind of are dismissive and avoidant of issues. Stage -3 is where they become attacking and rejecting in terms of their understanding of discriminations in that area. So if we're talking about disability, they can be attacking and rejecting of people who've got disabilities. If we're talking about racism, they can be attacking and rejecting of people who who are different, and and that shows up very much in kind of in their kind of racial bias and prejudice. Stage -4 is where people are showing much more anger and blaming of those who are different. So that can be either ethnic minorities or any other groups who are different. And stage -5 is where the behaviors become much more entrenched and the views become much more entrenched and the blaming becomes much more entrenched. And stage -6 is really where I see that kind of that spiraling down and where individuals are showing up in kind of much more extreme behaviors and views. And individuals, sometimes take on leadership roles in terms of kind of encouraging and, getting other people to join them in their extreme views and in their extreme beliefs. So I've really kind of covered and whizzed through what the different stages are. And what I want to talk about now is really just kind of reflect on some of that in a bit more detail. And I'm trying to kind of see whether I can get back to the LinkedIn page so that I can see the screen a bit more. So, I've talked recently and reflected on what's been happening in the United States of America in terms of the shootings and in terms of the violence. And, over here in the United Kingdom, we've seen, violence against women. And I really believe that the six stages framework, as I've said, can be used as a tool to really kind of get a better understanding of some of the behaviors and how they show up in any of the areas. So whether we're talking about violence against women or whether we're talking about disability or whether we're talking about racism. And what's been really interesting, when we've been, listening to some of the news report, around the really kind of tragic events in Uvalde and also in Buffalo, is that we're often provided with a picture of individuals who are showing up, as I see it, very much at the negative axis of the six stages framework. So, you're seeing the very kind of extreme behaviors. And I suppose my question is, you know, what is our understanding of those behaviors earlier on within the framework? And how can we support individuals and communities to be able to identify where individuals are in terms of their behaviors before they spiral down into, kind of the negative axis and into -6 on the negative axis? And I really believe that, as I've said, in my previous posts and recordings, no one becomes an extremist, overnight. No one becomes, a shooter overnight, you know, and that, there are signs and symptoms. We just have to get better at identifying what they are. But our ability to identify what the signs and symptoms are starts with us being able to unpick and identify what the behaviors are so that we can become better at talking about behaviors and looking at the developmental progression of those behaviors um, on the positive axis, but also on the negative axis. So really kind of getting a sense of, what do the positive behaviors look like, but also what do the negative behaviors look like? And so I do feel that that's really important to do, because it's only by providing us ourselves with a language to explore these challenges and these discriminations that we can actually begin to then kind of set in place action plans and support people to reflect on where they are developmentally and to think about what needs to be different, for them to progress, in terms of in terms of those stages. Okay, so I've kind of reached the end of my recording, and I've kind of, as I've said, I've done this twice, because it didn't work the first time. So I'm hoping that this time it has worked and that I've been able to live stream onto LinkedIn. If it hasn't worked, what I'm going to be doing is I'll be sharing the recordings I've made on Zoom and also and either on YouTube, but and also on Anchor in terms of as a podcast. So I'm going to bring things to a close, and thank you so much for joining me. Um, and I'll be running these live streams. I'm hoping I'll be running them on a regular basis. And I'm hoping to kind of get better at kind of managing, all the different tech which goes with this. But for now, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed this first LinkedIn live stream that I've done. Thank you. Bye.